What if everything you've ever believed about where humanity began was missing an entire chapter? Imagine a single discovery forcing scientists to redraw the very first page of our story. Welcome to Soft History Stories, where we uncover the forgotten mysteries and remarkable discoveries that changed history forever. For much of the previous century, if you asked scientists where modern humans first appeared, the answer seemed straightforward: East Africa, around 200,000 years ago, most likely in Ethiopia. History books presented it as a single location on a map and one clear point on a timeline. Neat, uncomplicated, settled. But what if one cave, hidden within a mountain in Morocco, completely overturned that familiar picture? Not by a few thousand years, but by nearly 100,000 years. And instead of East Africa, the evidence came from the rugged landscape near Marrakesh, on the opposite side of the continent. The place is known as Jebel Irhoud. In 2017, researchers announced a discovery that completely reshaped the opening chapter of human history. Fossils uncovered there, including jaw bones, pieces of skull and teeth, were dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. That number is accurate. 300,000 years. It pushed the known origin of our species back by roughly 100,000 years, beyond what many scientists had confidently accepted only a day before the announcement. What made the discovery even more remarkable was what researchers saw when they examined the fossils in greater detail. The faces appeared surprisingly familiar, with flat, delicate features that wouldn't seem unusual if you walked past someone with them today. Yet when scientists studied the brain case, the portion of the skull surrounding the brain, they found something very different. It was long and archaic, resembling the skulls of much older human ancestors rather than those of modern people. It was almost as though a modern-looking face had been placed onto an ancient skull. So what exactly does that mean? Were these individuals fully modern humans, early members of our species, or something that existed somewhere between the two? That fascinating contradiction lies at the heart of everything we're about to explore. Before we continue, it's important to make one thing clear. Some of what you'll hear is supported by broad scientific agreement within paleoanthropology. Other ideas remain the subject of ongoing debate, discussed by researchers, challenged in academic papers, and refined as new evidence appears. I'll point out which is which along the way, because that's how science truly moves forward. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through evidence gradually building a clearer picture over time. Get challenged, revised, and slowly, painfully refined into something closer to the truth. If you're listening to this late at night, letting it play while you drift off, that's exactly what these videos are made for. So do me a favor, drop a comment, and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right there. I love seeing that. Last week alone, I had someone in Tokyo at sunrise and someone in Chicago right at midnight, all listening to the same story about a cave in Morocco. It's a strange, wonderful thing, and if you want to keep listening without ads interrupting the flow, without background music messing with the pacing, you can follow this show on Spotify. Links in the description. It helps support the research and the writing that goes into these scripts, and it makes for a much smoother listening experience, especially if you use these to fall asleep, like a lot of you tell me you do. So let's go back to a mine in Morocco, decades before anyone understood what had actually been found there. Because the story of Jebel Irhoud doesn't start with scientists carefully excavating a landmark site. It starts almost by accident underground, with miners looking for something else entirely. So let's actually unpack that old story before Jebel Irhoud crashed the party. Here's what most scientists would have told you with a pretty straight face. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in East Africa around 200,000 years ago. One place, roughly one time, a single cradle of humanity nestled somewhere in the Rift Valley. From there, this story goes. Our ancestors eventually spread out first across Africa, then out into the rest of the world. It's clean. It's satisfying. It fits neatly into a textbook diagram with an arrow pointing confidently from a single dot in Ethiopia to literally everywhere else on Earth. And it wasn't a story pulled out of thin air. East Africa earned its starring role through decades of genuinely important fossil finds. There's Homo kibish, discovered back in the late 1960s in Ethiopia, with skulls that looked remarkably modern and got dated to around 195,000 years old. Then there's Rewrote, also in Ethiopia, adding more fossils to the pile. More evidence pointing to East Africa as the place where anatomically modern humans first show up in the fossil record. Add to that decades of genetic research, mitochondrial DNA studies, tracing maternal lineages back to a relatively recent common ancestor, often nicknamed mitochondrial Eve, and you've got what looked like overwhelming converging evidence, fossils and genes telling the same tidy story. East Africa 200,000 years ago, case closed. But here's the thing about origin as a word. It sounds simple, but it's actually doing a lot of sneaky work, because when scientists say origin of humans, they could mean several genuinely different things. Anatomical origin. When did skeletons start looking like ours? Behavioral origin. When did humans start acting like us, making art, using symbols, planning ahead? Genetic origin. When do our DNA lineages trace back to population origin? Where were the actual groups of people living, mixing, and evolving? These questions don't necessarily have the same answer. A population could look anatomically modern in one place while behaving in ways we'd recognize as modern somewhere else entirely at a totally different time. The old single cradle model kind of smushed all these questions together into one convenient package. East Africa, 200,000 years, done and done. Now, here's where things get a little uncomfortable, scientifically speaking, because where researchers look for fossils isn't random. It's shaped by where fossils are likely to survive, and where paleontologists have historically focused their digs. East Africa has incredible conditions for fossil preservation. Volcanic ash layers perfect for dating, dramatic geological formations that expose ancient sediment, and decades of established research infrastructure funding university partnerships, entire academic careers built around specific valleys and riverbeds. North Africa, by comparison, got far less attention from paleoanthropologists for most of the 20th century. Fewer excavations, fewer research teams, less funding directed that way. So when the fossil records seemed to point overwhelmingly toward East Africa, there was a legitimate question lurking underneath all that confidence. Were we looking at where humans actually originated, or were we looking at where scientists happened to be looking? This is exactly why a site like Jebel Irhoud, sitting quietly in the Moroccan desert, didn't fit anywhere into the old picture. North Africa wasn't supposed to be part of this story. Not according to the tidy single cradle model everyone had agreed on, which makes what happened next, when researchers finally took a serious look at what was buried in that mountain, all the more disruptive. To see why Jebel Irhoud blew up that tidy origin story, you first have to know where it actually is. Picture northern Morocco, not the postcard beaches, but inland. Jebel Irhoud is a low, rocky outcrop between Marrakesh and the Atlantic coast on the northwestern shoulder of Africa. Today, that region is semi-arid steppe and scrub, edging toward desert in places, but it sits at a kind of crossroads. Turn one way and you're looking toward the Mediterranean and Europe, across the Strait of Gibraltar. Turn another and you're staring into the Sahara and the long corridors that lead deeper into Africa. That geography matters. North Africa isn't just the top of the continent. It's a potential bridge zone, a place where populations could move west along the Mediterranean rim or north-south between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe whenever climates allowed. During green Sahara phases, when monsoon rains shifted north and the desert bloomed with lakes and grasslands, this whole belt would have been far more habitable than it looks today. In those wetter windows, Morocco wasn't a dry cul-de-sac at the edge of nowhere. It was an on-ramp to multiple migration routes, and buried in that on-ramp was a mine. Jebel Irhoud wasn't discovered by some carefully planned paleoanthropological expedition in the 1960s. It was an active bauxite mine. Workers were blasting the hillside for aluminum ore, hauling out chunks of rock when they hit something unexpected. Bones in a pocket of reddish sediment, At first, nobody thought ancient human ancestors. They thought cave. The bones were sent off to researchers who quickly realized they were dealing with hominin fossils, but that's where the clarity stopped. A partial skull with a face that looked oddly familiar. Bits of jaw, teeth, some limb bones. They seemed old, but how old? And what were they exactly? This was where Jebel Irhoud slipped straight into scientific limbo. Early on in the late 1960s and 70s, the fossils were tentatively linked to Neanderthals, partly because Neanderthals were already known from Europe, and the idea of a North African Neanderthal felt comfortable. Then dating techniques available at the time suggested they might only be around 40,000 years old. That would have put them near the very end of the Neanderthal timeline, overlapping with early modern humans. So for decades, Jebel Irhoud was filed away in the literature as an odd, somewhat confusing late Plein site. Interesting, sure, but not revolutionary. The specimens were often labeled Irhoud Neanderthals or vaguely archaic Homo sapiens, and everybody moved on because the big human origin story was supposedly playing out thousands of kilometers to the east. There was just one problem. The site itself had been a mess. When mining operations blasted through Jebel Irhoud, they destroyed parts of the original cave and scrambled huge chunks of the sediment. Fossils were scooped up from spoil heaps rather than carefully mapped in place. For a long time, that made it almost impossible to say exactly which bones came from which layer or how they related to the stone tools and animal remains that were mixed in. In paleoanthropology, that context is everything. You don't just want a skull. You want to know what layer of sediment it came from, what other bones lay beside it, whether there were tools nearby, whether there's charcoal from fires, whether the layer was still in its original position or had been shifted by erosion, animal burrows, or in this case, dynamite. For Jebel Irhoud, the big turning point came when researchers went back to the site with modern methods and a lot more patience. They literally had to re-excavate a place that had already been half destroyed. That meant tracing the remaining intact sediments, identifying undisturbed pockets of the ancient cave floor, and building a three-dimensional picture of which areas were still in place and which were hopelessly churned. What they found was that not everything had been ruined. There were still secure layers, sealed pockets that preserved the original arrangement of bones, tools, and hearths. By focusing on those, they could separate the trustworthy evidence from the mining chaos. And once they did, the human remains from Jebel Irhoud started to look a lot more interesting. This wasn't just one individual. The site has yielded at least 5 different people. Parts of a nearly complete adult skull with a remarkably modern-looking face, another partial cranium, fragments of a mandible, and remains from juveniles, including a child's jaw and teeth. Multiple individuals from roughly the same time period tell you you're not just dealing with an accident or a single burial. You're seeing a community, a population that matters because evolution doesn't work on lone specimens. You want to know, were these features common in a group? Are we looking at a population that consistently shows a particular mix of traits, or a one-off weirdo? Jebel Irhoud gave us a sample, not just a type specimen. And those people weren't living there in some abstract vacuum. The secure layers at Irhoud are packed with Middle Stone Age tools, carefully made flake points, scrapers, and other implements, and crucially, with evidence of fire, charcoal, burned bones, hearth features, places where people were repeatedly using fire to cook animals they'd hunted on the surrounding landscape. That association is gold. Fossils are one thing, tools are another, and burnt bones yet another. But when you can say with confidence, these specific humans in this specific layer were making this specific style of tool and using controlled fire here, that's when you can start reconstructing a way of life, not just a skeleton. It also means you can compare the tools from Jebel Irhoud look a lot like Middle Stone Age technologies found much farther east in Africa. The hunting patterns hinted at by the animal bones and cut marks fit with what we see at other early Homo sapiens sites. Suddenly, this weird Moroccan cave wasn't an outlier anymore. It was part of a broader cultural landscape. For a long time, the dating confusion and the mining damage kept Jebel Irhoud in the background. The fossils were there, the tools were there, the hearths were there, but nobody had put all the pieces together with modern techniques. Once they did, the whole picture shifted. Because when researchers finally nailed down the ages of those secure layers, it turned out these familiar-looking faces in Morocco weren't 40,000 years old Neanderthals at the late edge of history. They were almost 300,000 years old, and that single number forced everyone to reopen the question, where exactly did modern humans begin? If you're going to claim that a site in Morocco has humans almost 300,000 years old, you can't just wave your hands and say, trust us. You have to show in excruciating detail how you know that number isn't made up. That's where the dating story at Jebel Irhoud gets interesting, because it isn't based on a single clever trick. It's a whole stack of methods, each one with its own physics, its own sources of error, and its own way of anchoring those bones in time. Start with the fires. Those hearths you heard about aren't just cozy details. In a site like Rewrote, they're timestamps. Every time our ancestors built a fire on that cave floor, the heat did something very specific to the stone tools around it, especially the flint. Flint contains tiny mineral crystals that behave like microscopic radiation detectors. As soon as they're buried, they start soaking up background radiation from the surrounding sediments and cosmic rays from space. Each hit from that radiation knocks electrons into little traps in the crystal structure. Over thousands of years, more and more electrons get stuck. The longer the flint sits in the ground, the fuller those traps become. Now imagine you take that buried flint and heat it up in a fire to several hundred degrees C. That heat empties the traps. The electron clock is reset to 0. From that moment on, the flint starts quietly reaccumulating trapped electrons at a rate determined by the local radiation environment. Thermal luminescence dating, or TL, is basically the art of reading that clock. In the lab, you take one of those fire-reddened flints from Jebel Irhoud and you heat it up under controlled conditions. As the trapped electrons are released, they emit a faint glow, actual light that you can measure. The intensity and pattern of that glow tell you how many trapped electrons had built up since the last heating event. Combine that with measurements of the radiation dose the flint has experienced in the ground, and you can convert number of trapped electrons into years since this thing was last really hot. At Irhoud, the team dated flints that were clearly part of the ancient hearths in the secure layers, not random pieces from disturbed sediments, but stones that had been heated in the same fires people used to cook their food. That's crucial because it ties the date not just to the rock, but to the human activity. Those TL results clustered around 300,000 years ago. Not a single point, but a range roughly in the 280,000 to 350,000 year window once you include the uncertainties. Already that was enough to knock the old 40,000 year estimate into the trash bin. But TL alone wasn't going to convince everyone, especially at such great ages where small errors in radiation dose can balloon into big age differences. So the researchers brought in backup electron spin resonance, or ESR. ESR is another method that uses the same basic principle, trapped electrons building up over time, but reads the clock in a different way and often on different materials. Instead of heating up the sample, you put it in a strong magnetic field and blast it with microwaves. The trapped electrons respond in characteristic ways depending on how many of them there are and what kind of traps they're sitting in. The result is a spectrum that can be interpreted to give you a total radiation dose absorbed since the clock was last reset. Crucially, ESR can be applied directly to tooth enamel and to certain minerals in the surrounding sediments. Human and animal teeth at Irhoud, which were buried in the same layers as the tools and hearths, became perfect candidates. Why teeth? Because when a tooth is formed in a living animal, its enamel is effectively zeroed out just like flint in a fire. Once it's in the ground, it starts absorbing radiation. ESR lets you measure how much dose that enamel has soaked up, and after accounting for the local radiation environment over time, convert that into an age. At Jebel Irhoud, ESR dating of teeth from the undisturbed layers told the same story the heated flints were whispering. The ages came out in the same general range, roughly 300,000 years, give or take tens of thousands. This is the key move in modern paleoanthropology. You never want to lean on a single line of evidence if you can help it. Each method has different assumptions, different ways it can go wrong. TL is sensitive to whether the flint was fully heated and whether the radiation dose rate has been stable. ESR is sensitive to how uranium and other elements moved in and out of the tooth and sediments over time. By using both on different materials, you get independent clocks that you can compare. When those independent clocks line up, when the flints dated by TL, the teeth dated by ESR, and the stratigraphic story of the sediments all converge on the same ballpark, your confidence goes way up, not because anyone is infallible, but because different sources of error are unlikely to conspire to produce the same wrong answer. That's why you'll hear researchers say the Irhoud fossils are about 315,000 years old, often with a reported age like 315,000 plus or minus 34,000 years. That plus or part is not a footnote. It's the science. 300,000 years in this context doesn't mean on Tuesday, June 14th, 298,017 BCE. It means something more like when you take into account measurement errors, uncertainties in the radiation dose rate, possible changes in sediment chemistry over time, and the internal scatter among different samples. The most likely age cluster for these layers sits somewhere in the mid-300,000 seconds to high 200,000 seconds. The central estimate is around 315,000, but we know there's a range. In other words, 300,000 years is a shorthand for these humans lived roughly 3 times farther back in time than the classic 100,000-year-old East African Homo sapiens fossils we used to treat as the main starting line. The exact number might shift a bit as methods improve, but we're not going to discover they were actually Holene farmers with bad calendars. It's also worth clearing up a common misconception. Scientists don't usually date the bones themselves, especially at these ages. Radio-Auburn, the method people tend to know, only works reliably back to about 50,000 years. Beyond that, there's simply not enough radioactive carbon left, so instead, they date the context. They date the flints that were heated in the fires those humans built. They date the teeth of the animals those humans hunted, buried in the same layers. They date the sediments that entombed everything. Then they ask, are the fossils clearly from that same undisturbed layer? If the answer is yes, the age of the layer is the age of the fossils. At Jebel Irhoud, that contextual web is unusually strong. The hominin remains the Middle Stone Age tools, the hearths, the animal bones. They all come from the same well-defined horizon. TL and ESR working off different aspects of that horizon. Both point to deep time roughly 300,000 years ago. Once that was established, the rest of the story could finally unfold. If people with such familiar faces were already in Morocco at that time, depth, what exactly did those faces look like? And how modern were they really compared to us? When the first good skulls from Jebel Irhoud were cleaned up and put back together, the reaction from a lot of researchers was basically, wait, that looks like us. Not in a vague 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth kind of way. In very specific, measurable ways. Look at the face from the front. The midface is tucked in, not jutting far out like in many earlier humans. In paleo speak, that means reduced prognathism. The dental arcade doesn't project forward in a big muzzle. The nose and upper jaw sit under the forehead in a way that if you saw a reconstruction on the street, you wouldn't necessarily think ancient hominin. You'd think kind of rugged modern human. Check the cheekbones. In earlier species like Homo heidelbergensis, the cheeks tend to be more flared and heavy, giving the face a deeper, more snouty look. At Irhoud, the cheek region is shallower and more delicate. The zygomatic bones, the actual cheekbones, are shaped and angled in a way that's very close to later Homo sapiens fossils. The whole midface has that flat, retracted look we're used to seeing in ourselves. Even the jawline is telling. The Irhoud mandibles are fairly light and gracile compared to classic archaic humans. They don't have the massive buttress jaws you see in Neanderthals. They're trending toward the slim lower face that characterizes us, even though they don't have a full modern chin yet. These are the details that made headlines like "Oldest Homo sapiens found in Morocco" show up everywhere, because if you just cover the top of the skulls and look at the faces, they fall well within what scientists would call modern-like variation. But that kind of judgment isn't done by eyeballing photos and going, "Looks modern enough, there's a whole geometry to it." Modern paleoanthropology is obsessed with shape, not just size. Researchers mark a series of anatomical landmarks on each skull, tiny repeatable points like the corners of the eye sockets, the base of the nose, the edges of the dental arcade, the highest point of the cheekbone, the junctions where sutures meet. You can think of each skull as a constellation of dozens, sometimes hundreds of points in three-dimensional space. Then they take CT scans or surface scans and build 3D models. With those models, they run what's called geometric morphometrics. That basically means they compare the relative positions of those landmarks across many specimens, standardizing for things like overall size and orientation. Software can then show how one skull has to warp to match another, or where a particular fossil sits within a cloud of modern and archaic shapes. When they did this with the Irhoud faces, something striking emerged in these shaped space plots. The Irhoud individuals clustered closer to recent Homo sapiens than to Neanderthals or to more archaic African fossils. Their facial geometry occupied the same general region as us. Statistically, these weren't just vaguely human. They were specifically Homo sapiens, like in the front of the skull. That's why you'll often hear the phrase, "modern face, archaic brain case" about Jebel Irhoud. The face is doing something recognizably sapiens. The top and back of the skull are still catching up. Now, what do you do with that taxonomically? Do you slam down a label and call them anatomically modern humans? Do you split hairs and invent new species names? This is where things get messy. Facial modernity matters for classification. Our reduced prognathism, flat midface, and gracile cheeks are part of what defines Homo sapiens in the fossil record. If you see those traits starting to appear 300,000 years ago in Morocco, that's a strong hint that the lineage leading to us is already well underway and maybe already deserves the name. But it's not the whole story, and scientists know it. For one thing, evolution doesn't rewrite the entire skull at once. It's modular. Different parts can change at different speeds and in different directions. That's what people mean by mosaic evolution. You might have a very modern-looking face combined with a more archaic brain case, or vice versa. You might have a basically modern skeleton attached to a hand that still looks surprisingly primitive, or a pelvis that's modern while the shoulders look older. Jebel Irhoud is a classic mosaic. The front half of the head says Homo sapiens, or very close. The back half, the long low brain case, says hold on, not quite there yet. If you only had the face, you'd be comfortable calling it modern. If you only had the vault, you might hedge and say early Homo sapiens or late archaic Homo. This is why anatomically modern human is not a simple checkbox. There isn't one trait where if you see it you declare, okay, that's us now. Instead, there's a shifting bundle of features. Globular brain case, small brow ridges, chin development, retracted face, lighter skeleton, certain dental characteristics. Different fossils pick up different parts of that bundle at different times and in different places. So when you hear scientists describe as early Homo sapiens or near the root of the Homo sapiens cade, that's not them dodging. That's them trying to capture this mosaic reality without pretending evolution cares about our desire for clean category lines. Under the hood, classification is always a judgment call. Researchers weigh dozens of characters, look at where specimens fall in those 3D morphometric spaces, compare them to large samples of modern humans and other hominins, and then decide where to draw the line between archaic and modern. Different teams sometimes draw that line in slightly different places. Some are lumpers, happy to fold a wide range of forms into Homo sapiens. Others are splitters, preferring to carve out Homo sapiens sensu stricto, the fully modern version, and treat everything else as side branches or subspecies. What Jebel Irhoud did was push that whole debate back in time. It showed that faces we would comfortably walk past on a crowded street, aside from maybe a heavy brow and a slightly different nose, were already walking around North Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. But once you accept that, an obvious question follows. If the face looks familiar, what about the rest of the head? Is the brain inside that skull anything like ours? To answer that, you have to stop looking at the front and start paying attention to the back. If you rotate the Irhoud skulls and look at them in profile, the illusion of full modernity breaks. Instead of the high rounded, almost basketball-like dome you see in recent humans, the cranial vault at Jebel Irhoud is long and low. The forehead slopes back more. The highest point of the skull isn't pulled forward over the face the way it is in you and me. It sits further back, giving the whole thing a more stretched-out archaic silhouette. In technical terms, the vault is more elongated in the anteroposterior direction and less globular. It's closer to what you see in Middle Plein humans like Homo heidelbergensis than in later African Homo sapiens like Homo or Heto. That's why you'll sometimes see diagrams where modern humans are drawn with a kind of compact ballooned skull, Neanderthals with a long low one that bulges at the back, and a hooded sitting somewhere in between, still very much on the long low side. This is the part that made a lot of paleoanthropologists pause, because the face was screaming sapiens, but the brain case was very clearly muttering, "Not so fast." Now, a really important distinction here. Brain shape is not the same as brain size. The Irhoud individuals don't have tiny brains. When you estimate their cranial capacities from the preserved bones and virtual reconstructions, they fall comfortably in the lower to middle end of the modern human range. In terms of raw volume, they're basically us. You're not looking at some half-pint hominin. You're looking at a brain that in cubic cm could belong to a living person. What's different is how that volume is packaged. Think of it like two computers with the same number of transistors laid out on different circuit boards. Same basic capacity, different architecture. In our case, the board is the skull, and the way it balloons out tells you something about how the brain inside is arranged. We can't pull the brains out of 300,000-year-old skulls, but we can do the next best thing: make endocasts. An endocast is essentially a mold of the inside of the cranial cavity. In the old days, people literally poured latex or plaster into skulls and peeled it out. Today we use CT scans to generate virtual endocasts, 3D models of the internal surface of the bone, which mirrors the gross shape of the brain that once filled it. Endocasts don't give you wiring diagrams. You can't see individual neurons or detailed connectivity. What you do see are broad contours. Which regions are expanded, how the frontal and parietal lobes are shaped, how the overall curvature compares to other species. When researchers built virtual endocasts of the Irhoud skulls and compared them to those of Neanderthals, earlier African humans, and recent Homo sapiens, a clear pattern emerged. In size, a hood fits with us. In shape, it clusters with the more archaic pattern. The back of the brain, the occipital region, extends further behind the ear region than in modern humans. The top is flatter with less of the globular expansion that's characteristic of our species. The frontal region associated in living humans with things like planning, social cognition, and language doesn't show the same degree of bulging and reorganization you see in later Homo sapiens endocasts. Again, nobody can say this means they thought like this or they couldn't do that. That would be overclaiming. Endocasts are blunt instruments, but they do strongly suggest that at 300,000 years ago, the overall architecture of the Homo sapiens brain was still in transition. In other words, you can't just imagine dropping a modern brain into an archaic shell. The face and the cranial vault are both telling you that different parts of the head evolved along slightly different timelines. That's mosaic evolution in action. And Jebel Irhoud lets you see it almost in freeze frame. Instead of a single clean upgrade where one generation of archaic humans gives birth to the first anatomically modern people, you see a patchwork of traits shifting at different speeds. The face gets modern looking earlier. The vault and the underlying brain shape lag behind and only later converge on the true globular Homo sapiens pattern you see in fossils like Homo kibish, 195,000 years old, or in Upper Paleolithic Europeans. This idea of staggered change isn't unique to us. You can spot the same pattern all over the hominin family tree. Take Homo erectus, for example. Early African erectus still looks quite primitive in many ways. Small brain, heavy brow, long, low skull. Later Asian erectus, hundreds of thousands of years down the line, has a brain that nearly reaches the lower modern human range, but it's still housed in a vault that looks nothing like ours. Brain size is moving. Vault shape is still conservative. Or, consider Neanderthals. They share our big brains, and their front teeth and jaws can look surprisingly modern in some specimens, but their mid-face with that projecting nose and massive nasal cavity, and the distinctive shape of the back of the skull stays stubbornly Neanderthal. Some body regions, like their hands and inner ear structures, look closer to us. Others are wildly different. That's mosaic evolution again. Even within Homo sapiens, it plays out. Early African fossils that everybody agrees are us still often show combinations you wouldn't see today. Robust brow ridges with otherwise modern faces, or quite archaic-looking skull bases, combined with fully globular vaults. The package comes together gradually and not identically in different regions. So Jebel Irhoud fits a general rule rather than breaking it. Evolution tinkers. It modifies one module at a time. Face here, brain case there, pelvis over here, shoulder later. The parts don't all flip modern at once. That's where the big interpretive question around comes in. If you have a specimen with a modern-looking face, a brain of modern size but a skull shape that's still archaic, what do you call it? Is that early Homo sapiens? Is it Homo sapiens sensilato, the broad inclusive version of our species? Or is it a very close cousin, sitting just outside the strict sapiens definition, sharing many of our traits, but not yet fully within the modern envelope? Different researchers draw that line in different places. The team that published Irhoud is comfortable putting it inside Homo sapiens, near the base of our branch. Others prefer to call it an early Homo sapiens psyche population, a side twig very close to the stem that leads to us. What almost everyone agrees on, though, is the bigger point. By 300,000 years ago, brain and skull evolution in Africa wasn't being driven by a single localized revolution. It was a gradual, regionally distributed process. Different populations were picking up different parts of the modern human package at different times, and those innovations could spread across the continent through gene flow and migration. Jebel Irhoud catches one of those populations mid-transition. The face looks like ours. The brain case reminds you that the story of becoming human was still very much underway. To really understand what those brains were doing in their world, you have to look beyond bone. You have to ask, what were these people actually doing with their hands, their tools, their fires, and their landscapes? And that's exactly what the archaeology at Irhoud lets us explore next. When archaeologists talk about Jebel Irhoud, they're not just excited about the skulls. They're excited about what was lying next to them, all around those fragmentary faces and brain cases. The site is packed with stone tools, not the chunky teardrop hand axes that dominated earlier periods, but a very different kind of toolkit. Smaller, thinner, more standardized. This is classic African Middle Stone Age technology, hundreds of thousands of years older than anyone expected to see it, paired with something that looks so much like us. If you pick up one of these tools, it feels like it's been designed for a specific job. There are elongated points with carefully shaped tips that could have been used as spearheads. There are scrapers with straight retouched edges, perfect for working hides. There are flakes with razor-sharp margins, ideal for cutting meat or plant fibers. The overall impression is of people who weren't just breaking rocks. They were thinking in terms of tool categories, functions, and probably even rec keys for how to make each one. And that's where the level wire method comes in. Level Y is one of those technical words that gets thrown around so much it starts to sound like jargon, but the idea behind it is actually pretty intuitive. Imagine you want a particular kind of flake, a certain size, a certain shape, already sharpened along one edge. You could just start whacking a rock at random and hope something usable comes off. That's basically what earlier homins did, or you could plan ahead. In Levoy technology, you take a good quality stone and spend time shaping it into a prepared core. You carefully trim the outer surface so it has a particular convexity. Knock away flakes to create striking platforms and organize the whole thing so that when you finally deliver one well-aimed blow, the flake that pops off has the exact geometry you were aiming for. You're not just making a tool, you're engineering the source of the tools. The Jebel Irhoud assemblage is full of these prepared cores and the characteristic flakes and points they produce. That tells us several things at once. First, these people were planning their actions multiple steps ahead. You don't accidentally stumble into a level flake. You have to visualize the final product and work backwards. Second, they were investing effort in efficiency. A well-prepared core lets you get many standardized tools from a single piece of stone instead of wasting raw material. That kind of efficiency matters when you're mobile. The stone at Irhoud is mostly high-quality flint, and some of it seems to have been brought from outside the immediate area. That suggests people were either traveling long distances themselves or trading with neighboring groups to acquire the best material. Either way, you're looking at a way of life where people were moving across the landscape with mental maps of where to find water, game, and good rock. Now, what were they doing with those beautifully prepared points? Most researchers think at least some of them were armatures for spears. Whether those spears were thrust by hand at close range or thrown from a distance, possibly with the help of spear throwers, is still debated. Direct evidence is hard to come by, but the combination of pointed tools, cut-marked animal bones, and a few impact fractures on some pieces paints a picture of active hunting rather than opportunistic scavenging. At Jebel Irhoud, there are remains of medium-sized animals like gazelles, and also larger game, including ECIDs and possibly even bigger mammals. The bones show cut marks consistent with systematic butchery, skinning, disarticulating joints, stripping meat from limbs. In some cases, the way bones are broken suggests people were cracking them open to get at the marrow, squeezing every last calorie out of a kill. Again, you have to be careful not to spin a full National Geographic scene from a few bones and flakes. We don't know exactly how they coordinated their hunts, how many people were involved, or what kind of tactics they used, but the pattern fits with a group that could reliably acquire meat, process carcasses efficiently, and maybe even specialize in particular kinds of prey depending on season and habitat. And then there's the fire. The sediments at Jebel Irhoud are riddled with evidence of burning, reddened earth, ash residues, heat-altered stone, and bones that have clearly been exposed to high temperatures. Some of the stone tools themselves show signs of having been deliberately heat-treated. Heating certain kinds of flint makes it easier to flake and allows for even finer control over the resulting edges. That's a whole extra layer of pyrotechnology, using fire not just to cook food or stay warm, but to modify materials. Fire at a site like this is almost certainly not just the result of natural bushfires sweeping through. The distribution of burned areas and the association with artifacts and bones look like repeated localized hearth use. Think of small controlled fires started and maintained by people who knew exactly how to manage them. What does that buy you? Cooking, for one. Even if we can't see the menu, cooked meat and plants are easier to chew, safer to eat, and yield more net energy. In evolutionary terms, that's a massive advantage. Warmth, obviously, especially in cool nights or seasonal cold snaps. Light after dark, which extends the active part of the day and opens up new social possibilities. And then, there's the less tangible but probably crucial piece: social life around the fire. You don't get a transcript of conversations from 300,000 years ago, but ethnographic parallels from recent hunter-gatherers suggest that firesides are where stories are told, knowledge is passed on, and group bonds are reinforced. If Irhoud people had anything like the proto-languages and symbolic capacities hinted at by their broader technological world, the glow of those hearths, would have been the backdrop for a lot of teaching, gossip, and planning. Again, we have to keep the speculation in check. We don't see art at IUD. We don't see carved figurines or engraved ochre. This is not the full Upper Paleolithic package you might associate with behaviorally modern humans, but we do see a level of technical sophistication level cause possible heat treatment systematic butchery that looks strikingly advanced for such an early date. And that's where Irhoud really messes with any neat timeline that tries to tie behavior directly to anatomy. Remember, the brain cases here are still archaic in shape. The frontal regions don't show the same derived globularity you see in later Homo sapiens. If you were only looking at the skull from the back, you might be tempted to put these people earlier on the evolutionary ladder. But when you look at what they were doing with stone and fire, they're firmly in the Middle Stone Age world, a world that in some ways feels closer to later sapiens than to their more primitive ancestors. In other words, at Jebel Irhoud, modernish behavior and modernish faces are living side by side with not quite modern brain architecture. The package is still coming together, but parts of the behavioral toolkit are already surprisingly sophisticated. That disconnect is a warning against simple stories. You can't look at a globular skull and automatically assume a particular level of technology or vice versa. Evolution doesn't flip all the switches at once. Cognition, culture, anatomy, and ecology all interact, but they don't march in perfect step. Irhoud gives us a snapshot of that messy out-of-sync process. Skilled toolmakers with prepared core technology, competent hunters processing animal carcasses, fire users managing heat, light, and maybe even material properties. All of it unfolding in a North African landscape that at times looked very different from the desert we see today. To understand just how different and why these people were there in the first place, you have to zoom out from the cave and look at the entire region at a Sahara that sometimes wasn't a barrier at all, but a green corridor binding Africa together. If you stood outside Jebel Irhoud today and looked south, you'd see why the Sahara has such a mythic reputation. From space, it's this giant beige smear, a continent-sized do not enter sign made of rock and sand. It feels like a hard boundary. North Africa up here, real Africa down there, and between them, a lifeless wall. But that version of the Sahara is just a snapshot. Stretch the timeline out and the wall starts breathing. To see why, you have to talk about something that sounds boring but secretly controls half of Earth's climate drama: Milankovitch cycles. Earth doesn't orbit the sun in a perfectly steady, unchanging way. Its path wobbles. Its tilt shifts a little. The shape of the orbit stretches and relaxes over tens of thousands of years. Those three slow changes in eccentricity, tilt, and wobble of the axis alter how much solar energy different parts of the planet get at different times of year. Think of them as giant slow dials on the climate machine. One of those dials, Earth's axial precession, is especially important for North Africa. Over roughly 23,000 year cycles, it changes when in the year Earth is closest to the sun. That in turn changes how intense African summers are. During some phases, summers in the northern hemisphere get a serious power-up. The land heats more strongly that boosts the West African monsoon, the seasonal system that today brings rain into the Sahel. In these monsoon max periods, that rain doesn't just stop at the edge of the desert. It punches deep into what's now hyper-arid Sahara. Every time that happens, the Sahara flips. Sand seas become grasslands. Dune fields turn into savas scattered with trees and shrubs. Seasonal streams appear where there are only dry channels today. Lakes form in basins that are now crusted with salt. We call these intervals green Sahara phases or African humid periods. They've happened again and again over at least the last few million years. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. And they don't just make the desert less bad. They transform it into something that, from the perspective of hunter-gatherers, looks like opportunity. When the rains come north, you don't just get plants. You get animals following those plants. Antelope, gazelle, maybe even hippos and crocodiles in the bigger lakes and rivers. You get fresh water, you get fish, you get all the building blocks of a rich foraging landscape. Now, imagine you're living somewhere in what's now Morocco or Algeria or Libya 300,000 years ago during a green Sahara phase. The region to your south and east isn't an impassable void. It's a patchwork of habitable corridors, river valleys, lake chains, and broad grassy plains that stitch North Africa to the rest of the continent. Those corridors are the key. They mean that at certain times there's a continuous band of usable habitat running from the Atlantic coast of West Africa, across the interior, all the way to the Nile and into East Africa. Not a single highway, but a braided network of paths, oases, and floodplains that animals and people can move along. North Africa stops being a cul-de-sac. This has huge consequences for how we think about populations like the Irhoud people. When conditions are wet and the Sahara is green, groups in North Africa aren't isolated at the top of the continent. They can expand southward along rivers, chase herds into newly opened grasslands, and encounter other human populations doing the same from West or East Africa. Genes, ideas, and technologies can all move with them. When the orbit shifts again, the monsoon weakens, the rain retreats, lakes shrink, then vanish, grasslands brown out and die. Those same corridors pinch off. Now the Sahara swings back toward being a barrier. Populations that had once been connected get stranded in pockets of better habitat along coasts in mountain foothills near persistent springs. Groups that were part of a broad network become more regionally confined. So you get this long, slow pulse. Green phases, open doors. Migration, mixing, contact, dry phases, closed doors, isolation, local adaptation, divergence. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that opening and closing is like a genetic accordion. Populations spread out and blend, then get squeezed back into separate refuges, then spread and blend again when the next humid phase arrives. That's exactly the kind of process that can produce the mosaic pattern we see in early Homo sapiens fossils. One region might develop a particular facial structure. Another might push brain shape in a slightly different direction. A third might pioneer a specific stone tool tradition. When the Sahara goes green and corridors reconnect, those differences don't stay locked in place. People meet, intermarry, share techniques, and shuffle those traits back into a wider gene pool. Then the climate flips again, and the cycle repeats. There's another twist, though, and it affects what we can actually see. Archaeology depends heavily on being lucky about where evidence survives and is exposed. Green Sahara phases are fantastic for human life, but they're not always great for long-term preservation or visibility. If you're camping on the shore of a lake that will later fill in with sediments, your fireplaces and tools might get buried beneath meters of mud. From a scientist's point of view, that's both good and bad. Good because burial can protect artifacts for hundreds of thousands of years. Bad because you might need a river cutting through or modern erosion or a mining operation to slice down into those layers and expose them, like what happened at Jebel Irhoud. Meanwhile, during dry phases, that same region might be blasted by wind erosion, stripping away younger deposits and leaving older ones sitting closer to the surface. Sites from one humid interval can be totally erased. Others might suddenly appear. Ancient North Africa is biased by where the landscape has done us the favor of both preserving and revealing the record. We know green Sahara worlds existed. We can see ancient shorelines on satellite images, find fossilized fish and hippo bones in what's now desert, and dig up pollen that tells us about past vegetation. But the human piece of that puzzle is still patchy. That's where discoveries like Irhoud are so disruptive. They remind us that North Africa wasn't just a quiet backwater waiting passively for real humans to arrive from somewhere else. It was plugged into these continental-scale climate rhythms. Sometimes it was a periphery cut off by expanding dunes. Other times it was smack in the middle of a lush belt, linking distant populations. In those green windows, people who looked a lot like the Irhoud individuals with familiar faces, advanced Middle Stone Age toolkits, and not quite modern brain cases could have been moving across thousands of kilometers, interacting with other early Homo sapiens groups and helping shape the shared gene pool that would eventually give rise to us. To really make sense of that, You have to zoom out even further and stop thinking in terms of a single birthplace at all. Instead of one Eden where modern humans appear and then radiate out, you start seeing a continent-wide network of populations connected and disconnected by climate-driven corridors. That's the idea behind the Pan-African model, and Jebel Irhoud sits right at the heart of why that model has become so compelling. The Pan-African model starts with a simple but uncomfortable admission. There probably was no single Garden of Eden, no one magic valley where anatomically modern humans suddenly appeared, fully formed, and then marched out to populate the rest of the world. Instead, picture Africa 300,000 years ago, not as a stage with one spotlight, but as a whole continent of dim, flickering lanterns. Different regions hosting different groups, all recognizably human in some ways, all a bit strange in others, all connected and disconnected over time by shifting environments like that breathing Sahara you just saw. That's the core of the Pan-African idea. Homo sapiens didn't emerge from a single tiny founder population in one corner of Africa. It evolved within a web of semi-connected populations spread across the continent, each one contributing pieces to the final package that we now call modern humans. This is where Jebel Irhoud stops being just a Moroccan site and becomes a clue to a totally different way of thinking about our origins. For most of the 20th century, the story went something like this. Pick a region, usually East Africa, find a set of fossils that look especially modern, and call that place the cradle of humanity. Everything else is either a precursor or a sideshow. But as genetic data got better, that picture started to wobble. Modern African populations show very deep population structure. Translated from genetic speak, that means groups in different parts of Africa have been partially separated for a long time. Not just for a few tens of thousands of years, but for hundreds of thousands. Some lineages seem to have split from each other around the same time as, or even earlier than the oldest modern human fossils we know about. If that's true, then a single tiny founding group sitting in one small valley doesn't make much sense. You can't have all of Africa's current genetic diversity descend from a handful of people in one spot without either erasing that deep structure or compressing the timeline in ways that don't match the fossil record. Something more complicated and more interesting has to be going on. The Pan-African model says, instead of one isolated cradle, you have many semi-independent populations scattered across Africa. They diverge a bit when conditions isolate them. Say when deserts expand or forests fragment, and then mix again when climates swing back, corridors open, and people start moving and interbreeding. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that dance of divergence and reconnection creates what geneticists sometimes call a structured population. Not fully blended, not fully separated, more like an archipelago of islands with boats occasionally crossing between them. In that kind of system, modern human traits don't have to appear all at once in one location. A particular facial shape might be common in one region like we see at Irhoud. A specific change in brain organization might arise somewhere else. A new form of stone tool technology might be pioneered in a third, because there's still some gene flow between these populations over long time scales. Those traits can spread without any one group sweeping in and replacing everyone else. This is a key shift. You don't need a heroic out of East Africa wave that shows up and wipes out all the other archaic humans on the continent. You can have a slower, messier process where useful traits and successful cultural practices diffuse through intermarriage and cultural exchange. Think about how technology spreads today. Smartphones weren't invented everywhere at once, but you don't have to replace the entire population of a country to get them adopted. A few connections, a few early adopters, and suddenly that trait, owning a smartphone, is just what people do across the globe. Genes can work a bit like that, on longer timescales. A mutation that slightly improves brain wiring or immunity or reproductive success can creep through a network of populations over thousands of generations. Nobody has to conquer anybody. They just have to occasionally meet, have children, and keep surviving. In that sense, origin stops being a dot on a map and becomes a process stretched out in time and space. Instead of asking where did modern humans appear, the better question becomes over what regions and over how long did the package of traits we call sapiens gradually assemble. And that's where Ehud is so important. Because those 300,000-year-old faces from Morocco look so familiar, and those Middle Stone Age tools look so advanced. They force us to accept that very modern pieces of the puzzle were already present far from the traditional East African cradle very early in the game. Irhoud doesn't look like a weird dead-end experiment. It looks like a regional variation of early Homo sapiens. The faces fit inside the broad range of recent humans. The tools match what we see at roughly similar ages, much farther south and east. The differences, especially that elongated brain case, line up with the idea of a species still in the middle of becoming what we are. So instead of thinking modern humans evolved in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, then spread and odd-look faces, the Pan-African model encourages a different reading. By 300,000 years ago, populations across multiple parts of Africa, including North Africa, were already participating in the evolutionary process that would lead to us. None of them by themselves were fully modern, but none of them were irrelevant either. North African groups like the Rewrote people contribute their anatomical tweaks and cultural innovations into the wider continental network during humid phases. Other regions contribute theirs. Over time, selection filters and reshapes those inputs. Some traits persist and spread. Others fade out locally. The end result much later is a species that's globally recognizable. Us. The Pan-African model doesn't answer every question. There's still intense debate about which fossils should be counted as early Homo sapiens, how strong the regional differences were, and how far gene flow really reached between, say, southern and northern populations at different times. But it does give us a framework that fits a bunch of otherwise awkward facts at once. Deep genetic structure in Africa. Expected mosaic fossils with mixtures of archaic and modern traits scattered across the continent. Expected shared tool traditions like the Middle Stone Age popping up in widely separated regions. Also expected within that framework, Jebel Irhoud isn't an outlier we have to explain away. It's a crucial data point showing that the story of where we came from has always been bigger than a single valley, a single rift, or a single dot on a textbook map. And if Irhoud helps expand the map of our origins across the whole of Africa, the next step is to see how it connects with the other major fossils that have shaped this new picture. That's where places like Omoherto and Floresbad come in. If Irhoud is one lantern on that continent-wide stage, Omo and Herto in East Africa are two of the brightest others. Let's start with Omo Kibish in southern Ethiopia. The key skull there, Omoi, has been argued over for decades. Its age has been refined several times, but recent dating puts it at least around 230,000 years old, maybe a bit older. That makes it younger than Ehud in Morocco, but still very ancient in modern human terms. Morphologically, Omo, I look surprisingly familiar. Rounded brain case, high forehead, a chin you'd recognize in a crowd today. If you showed a reconstruction of Omo, I walking down a street in modern clothes, most people wouldn't give them a second look. There are some archaic details in the vault and brow region, but overall it's much closer to fully modern than Hood. So you get this weird situation. The oldest clearly modern-looking skull we have comes from East Africa and is younger than the more primitive-looking Irhoud faces in North Africa. That's one reason East Africa held on to the cradle title for so long. Omo looks like us. Arhoud looks like an earlier draft. Now slide forward in time a little and move just a few hundred kilometers north to Herto, also in Ethiopia. Herto has yielded a series of remarkable skulls dated to roughly 160,000 years ago. These are often labeled Homo sapiens in the scientific literature, basically an early, slightly more robust version of our species. The Herto skulls have big brain cases within modern size ranges, but their skull bones are thick. The brow ridges are more pronounced, and the face is a bit more projecting than in typical recent humans. In other words, if Homo is, yeah, that's basically us. Herto is us, but with the safety glass off-road package still attached. Both Homo and Rewrote sit squarely in East Africa in the region long treated as the main origin zone. Both are younger than Ode. Both look in different ways, more like fully modern humans than those Moroccan skulls with their strange elongated brain cases. This is where things get interesting. If you line them up in your head, at about 300,000 years ago, Homo somewhere after 230,000, Rewrote around 160,000. It's very tempting to see a neat progression. Early mosaic proto-sapiens in North Africa, more modern skeletons in East Africa a bit later, then increasingly normal-looking sapiens as you come forward in time. But the fossils are not that polite. To see why, you have to zoom far to the south to Florisbad in South Africa. Florisbad gave us a partial skull that's roughly 260,000 years old, give or take. That puts it right between Irhoud and Homo in age, and its anatomy is complicated. The brain case is large, within the lower end of modern human ranges. Some features of the face and vault look sapiens-like, but other details, the overall shape, certain robust areas, look more archaic, closer to older African forms. Different researchers have called the Florisbad skull different things over the years, archaic Homo sapiens Homo, or just left it in a kind of respectful limbo. It's clearly part of our side of the human family, but exactly where you draw the line between early Homo sapiens and something else is murky. And Florisbad isn't alone in blurring those lines. There are other head-scratchers, fossils from places like Nagaloba in Tanzania, Ilia Springs in Kenya, and several poorly preserved or fragmentary remains from Central and Southern Africa that mix traits in ways that refuse neat categorization. Even some later North African and Levantine fossils show mosaics of features that seem in between fully modern humans and more archaic forms. If you were hoping for a clean textbook ladder, at the bottom, Florisbad and Homo on a middle rung, Rewrote near the top, and then finally us, the real fossil record is more like overlapping branches on a very messy bush. That messiness is part biological, part sampling. Biologically, evolution in a structured continent-wide population is not going to produce one single transitional fossil where everything clicks into place. Different traits will evolve at different speeds in different regions under different pressures, so you expect skulls that look modern in some ways and old-fashioned in others. That's what Irhoud, Florisbad, Homo and Rewrote are actually showing us. But the sampling problem makes all of this look even weirder than it probably was at the time. We're dealing with a handful of skulls and fragments pulled from a time span of 300,000 years or more, scattered over a continent bigger than the United States, China, India, and Europe combined. That is a brutal level of undersampling. Entire populations, entire regional lineages, entire anatomies have probably come and gone, without leaving us a single bone we found so far. Imagine trying to reconstruct the history of European fashion for the last 500 years, but you're only allowed to look at 3 jackets, 1 pair of shoes and a hat, one from Italy in 1500, one from England in 1750, one from Sweden in 1900, plus a random sneaker from Portugal. You aren't totally sure about the date for. You'd get huge apparent jumps in style that in real life were probably gradual shifts. That's what our fossil timeline looks like. Big gaps, isolated snapshots. When you only see a few frames from an extremely long movie, the plot looks jumpy and everyone argues about what must have happened in the missing scenes. This is why debates over when modern humans appeared get so intense. Some researchers reserve fully modern for fossils like Homo, later Southern African finds and the skulls from places like School and Capsier in the Levant around 100,000 years ago. Faces and brain cases that fall well within the range of people alive today. Others talk about early Homo sapiens for forms like Rewrote and Florisbad. They're on our branch. They share crucial derived features with us, but they still have enough archaic traits that calling them indistinguishable from modern humans feels misleading. Those terms, early sapiens, archaic Homo sapiens, fully modern humans, sound precise, but they're really labels we're trying to slap onto a continuous, messy process. There isn't a day in the past where a baby was born, and suddenly the species descriptor flips from early to fully. What we're seeing instead are local versions of a long overlapping transition, and that's the key thing to remember about these famous sites. Homo, Hertau, Florisbad, here, how each one is a snapshot, a still frame from a massive, multi-rional, hundreds of thousands of years long film that we'll never see in full resolution. They're incredibly valuable, but they're not the whole story. They're points we've managed to plot on a graph whose lines we mostly have to guess. When you view them like that, as scattered glimpses of a continent-wide evolutionary experiment, the contradictions start to make sense, and the question shifts again. Instead of which site is the birthplace of modern humans, it becomes, how do all these partial stories fit together with what we know from genetics and archaeology? To answer that, you have to step out of Africa and then, intriguingly, back in again. When people hear 300,000-year-old Homo sapiens in Morocco, it's easy to mash two very different ideas together. One is, where did our species originate? The other is, when did our species start spreading across the rest of the world? Rewrote speaks very loudly to that first question. It says by 300,000 years ago, populations with key Homo sapiens traits were already living in North Africa as part of a bigger structured African meta-population. It does not say by 300,000 years ago, those people were marching into Europe and Asia and colonizing the planet. Those are separate stories. When scientists talk about out of Africa, they're usually talking about that second story, migrations out of the continent into Eurasia and beyond. And there the dates are much younger than I hooded. The big, well-supported pulse of expansion, the one that seeded most non-African populations alive today, sits around 60–70,000 years ago. You see it in genetics, a bottleneck signature shared by Europeans, Asians, indigenous Australians, Native Americans. You see it in archaeology, a spread of similar tool technologies, ornaments, and symbolic practices appearing across vast regions of Eurasia after about 60,000 years ago. That's long after Hood, Homo, Hertau, and Florisbad. So what does a Hood actually change about out of Africa? It pulls the evolution of African Homo sapiens deeper into the past and spreads it across the continent. It tells us that by 300,000 years ago, there were faces in Morocco you might recognize as human today, part of a species that was already diverging from older African forms. But it doesn't mean those Moroccan populations were the ones who later walked into Australia or Siberia or the Americas. In fact, the lineages that eventually left Africa in that big 60,000-year-ago wave may have come from quite different regions within Africa. And then there's the other wrinkle. Out of Africa wasn't one single event. There were earlier forays. The fossil and archaeological record outside Africa hints at multiple experiments in dispersal, some of them long before the famous 60,000-year wave. We have Homo sapiens like fossils at school and Kapsi in Israel, around 90–120,000 years old. We have stone tools and fragmentary remains in Greece, and maybe China, that some researchers argue could reflect early modern humans outside Africa over 100,000 years ago. More controversially, there are sites in Arabia and the Levant with Middle Stone Age-style tools that look very similar to African technologies and are dated to wet phases when the deserts, briefly. These early dispersals look like scouting missions on evolutionary timescales. Small populations moving out during favorable climate windows, hugging coasts or rivers, maybe mixing with Neanderthals or Denisovans, maybe dying out when conditions turn bad again. I heard fits into the background of those possibilities. If Homo sapiens-like populations were already present in North Africa by 300,000 years ago, then when the Sahara flipped into a green corridor, some of their descendants or their cousins further east could have pushed into the Levant or Arabia much earlier than our big textbook out of Africa. But here's the catch. An early origin date does not automatically drag the global spread date back with it. Just because a species exists at time X doesn't mean it instantly occupies its entire eventual range. Crocodiles are ancient, but Australia only got crocodiles when they could actually get there. Wolves are old, but they didn't colonize every forest the day they evolved. For Homo sapiens, a lot had to line up. Climate windows, ecological opportunities, technologies, social structures, maybe even cognitive capacities like complex language and long-distance trading networks. The fact that we see our species in Morocco at 300,000 years ago tells us when some key anatomical traits were in place. It does not tell us that those populations had the demographic heft or the cultural toolkit to permanently colonize Eurasia yet. So Irhoud stretches the roots of the Homo sapiens tree deeper into African soil. But the major branching out into Eurasia still looks like a comparatively late development. And then, just to make things more tangled, the story doesn't only go one way. There isn't just out of Africa. There's also back into Africa. Genetic studies over the last decade have shown clear signals of back migration. Populations that left Africa at some point mixed with other groups in Eurasia and then sent descendants back into Africa, especially into North and East Africa. You can see this in certain genomes where chunks of DNA look more closely related to non-African lineages than to deep African ones. In some regions, a substantial fraction of ancestry, 10–20% or more, seems to come from these returning migrants. This means that when you sample DNA from living Africans and try to reconstruct ancient population history, you're not looking at a simple, pristine, original Homo sapiens signal. You're looking at a palimpsest layers written over layers with Eurasian ink scratched back onto an African page. For sites like which sit in North Africa, that's especially important. The people who lived there 300,000 years ago were not carrying genes from Neolithic farmers in the Near East or Bronze Age steppe herders, but many modern North Africans are. So if you just look at present-day DNA and work backward without accounting for those back migrations, you can easily misplace where earlier ancestors lived or how diverse ancient African populations really were. IRA helps anchor that swirling genetic picture in real old African bones. It says, here is a population in North Africa 300,000 years ago with clearly sapiens-like faces and a very different brain case. They belong firmly inside Africa's evolutionary story before any of those later Eurasian returns. What it doesn't tell us is which exact lineages from this mosaic actually made it into that dominant 60,000-year-ago expansion. It doesn't tell us how much I-like ancestry, if any, survives in you or me. Those are the parts where we're still in hypothesis territory, trying to match fragmentary fossils, sparse ancient DNA, and complex modern genomes. So if we strip it down, Irhoud strengthens the idea that Homo sapiens is an African species with deep widespread roots across the continent. It supports a pan-African origin model, not a Levantine or Eurasian one. It allows for the possibility that some African populations north of the Sahara were well placed for earlier sorties into Eurasia when climates allowed. And it reminds us that out of Africa is only half the traffic. Later back into Africa events mean that modern DNA is a blended product, not a direct clean readout of what age populations were like. In other words, Irhoud rewrites the opening chapters of our story. Who was around in Africa, where and how early, but it leaves the later chapters of global spread and genetic mixing as a still evolving mystery. To untangle that, you have to look not just at where bones are found, but at how DNA and stones and climate all argue with and occasionally agree with each other. If it feels like the DNA story and the fossil story keep giving you different dates for when humans began, that's because they're answering different questions. When geneticists talk about a most recent common ancestor for, say, all human mitochondrial DNA or for a chunk of the Y chromosome, they're not talking about the first Homo sapiens walking around. They're talking about the last time a particular stretch of DNA had only one surviving version in the population. Imagine You're tracing the history of last names, not people. At some point in the past, every Hernandez in the phone book traces back to one family, even though millions of other people were alive at the time with totally different surnames. That doesn't mean humanity began with that one household in Mexico City. It just means the Hernandez line coalesces there. Genetic coalescence dates work the same way. Mitochondrial Eve, the woman whose mitochondrial DNA line is ancestral to all living humans, wasn't the only woman alive 150,200,000 years ago. She just happens to be the one whose particular mitochondrial lineage didn't die out. So when you hear our most recent common ancestor on the Y chromosome lived about 200,300,000 years ago, that is not the same as Homo sapiens appeared 200,300,000 years ago. Those dates are about when different lineages of genes converge, not when a brand new species steps onto the stage with a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Fossils, meanwhile, are answering yet another question. When do we first see anatomy that falls inside what we're willing to call Homo sapiens, like Homo hirto florispad? These are physical snapshots of bodies that lived at specific times in specific places. They tell you that by 300,000 years ago, there were skulls in Morocco with faces that look remarkably modern and brain cases that don't. They tell you that by 195,000 years ago in Ethiopia, there were individuals with even more modern proportions. But fossils are sparse. Whole continents and time periods are represented by a handful of skull fragments and teeth. It's like reconstructing a movie from 4 still frames. You know the characters existed at those frames. You don't know exactly what they were doing in all the missing shots. Genes fill in some of those missing frames, but they're working under their own constraints. One big complication is that Africa wasn't a simple branching tree where one ancestral population sat in East Africa, split once, and sent neat daughter lineages outward like subway lines radiating from a central station. Genetic data from living Africans, especially from understudied hunter-gatherer groups, points to something messier. Deep population structure inside Africa stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Think of Africa not as a single origin point, but as a whole archipelago of semi-connected populations. Some in East Africa, some in the South, some in West Africa, some in the North and the Saharan Belt. These groups weren't isolated like different species, but they also weren't blending into one panic soup every generation. They split, reconnected, mixed a bit, separated again. Climate pushed them together during wet phases and pulled them apart in dry ones. Rivers and forests formed corridors. Deserts and mountains built walls. Over hundreds of thousands of years that creates a web, not a ladder. When geneticists try to compress that web into a simple tree with one trunk and clean branches, the model strains. Coalescence dates from different parts of the genome don't agree neatly. Some lineages seem to stay split for a very long time inside Africa before merging. Others show signals of ghost ancestry from groups we haven't even identified in the fossil record. In that kind of tangled history, asking for a single boat, that boat but of Homo sapiens, is like asking for the exact second a river becomes the sea. You can define it any number of ways. Nature doesn't care. And then there's the brutal practical problem. In Africa, ancient DNA almost never survives. Most of the ancient genomes you hear about, Neanderthals from Siberia, Denisovans from a cave in the Li, early Europeans, Bronze Age steppe herders come from cold, dry, or at least seasonally freezing environments. Low temperatures slow down the chemical processes that shred DNA. Dry caves protect bones from microbes and groundwater. Africa, especially tropical Africa, is the opposite. Warm, often wet, biologically very active. Bones decay faster. DNA breaks down quickly. Even when you find fossils, they're often so degraded at the molecular level that you can't recover whole genomes from them. That means that for crucial periods of Homo sapiens evolution, 300,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, even 100,000 years ago, in many regions, we have almost no ancient African DNA at all. We're forced to use the genomes of living people as a noisy echo of much older population structures. So genetics can say it looks like our lineages inside Africa have been diverging and reconnecting for hundreds of thousands of years. But it can't yet pin those lineages to specific fossil skulls in specific ancient environments. That's where fossils and archaeology can actually push the history further back than genetics alone might suggest. If you only looked at coalescence dates from living genomes, you might conclude that the crucial phase of Homo sapiens evolution clustered around 200,000 years ago. Then Irhoud shows up at 300,000 years with faces you'd walk past on the street and not think twice about. Suddenly your genetic models have to stretch. Now you have to ask, were there lineages that split earlier than we realized, then later blended back in? Are some of the deepest African divergences older than our naive models suggest? Did some early branches go extinct, leaving only faint ghost traces in the genomes of people alive today? IRA doesn't give you those answers. It forces you to ask better questions. The sweet spot is where all these lines of evidence start to line up. When climate records show a green Sahara opening corridors and archaeology shows Middle Stone Age tools marching across those corridors, and genetics shows pulses of expansion and mixing at roughly the same timescales, that's when the picture sharpens. You can say during this wet phase, structured populations connected more, spreading certain tool traditions and genes. During this dry phase they fragmented, fostering local variation when a major wet phase overlapped with a particular set of cultural and anatomical innovations that may have set the stage for the later big out-of-Africa expansions. Irhoud is one of those anchor points. It tells the climate people. By 300,000 years ago, there were Homo sapiens, like populations in North Africa, living and hunting in this environment. It tells the geneticists, your models need to accommodate sapiens anatomy this early in this region as part of a structured African population system. The future of this story isn't fossils versus DNA. It's fossils, DNA, tools, and climate archives arguing with each other until their disagreements get small. Right now, they're still talking past each other on some details, exact dates, exact locations, exact branching patterns. But each new site, like a Irhoud, each new genome, each new lake sediment core that records ancient rainfall, pushes them a little closer together, and that's where the debates around Irhoud get really sharp. When people try to decide exactly how far to stretch those timelines, and how many different African populations get to claim a share in our origin story. Not everyone is ready to hand Jebel Irhoud the trophy for oldest Homo sapiens. Even among the people who work on the site, you'll hear careful hedging, early Homo sapiens, sapiens-grade faces, morphologically modern facial anatomy with archaic neurorania. Translation, it looks like us from the front, but from the top and the back, not so much. That's the first big debate. What exactly are we looking at? One camp says, yes, this is Homo sapiens, not fully modern but part of our species' long gradual emergence. They point to the flat face, reduced brow ridges, and dental proportions that fit comfortably within variation of later sapiens. In this view, Irhoud is like an awkward baby photo of our species. You can see the family resemblance, even if the hairstyle is questionable. The other camp is more cautious. They argue that if you strip away the labels and just look at shapes, skulls still have a lot in common with older, more archaic African forms. The long, low brain case, the angled back of the skull, some aspects of the jaw, these don't fit neatly inside the range of, say, Homo or her toe. So they propose a different framing. Maybe Irhoud represents an archaic African Homo population that just happens to have a very sapiens-like face, a cousin line close to our ancestry, maybe contributing genes, but not necessarily us in the strict taxonomic sense. Both sides are arguing over a fuzzy boundary. Species aren't Pokemon evolutions with clean stage changes. There's no single diagnostic bone that flips from not sapiens to sapiens on a Tuesday. What anatomists choose to call Homo sapiens at 300,000 years ago is partly scientific judgment, partly convention. Then there's the dating. If you push a lot of the drama evaporates. The current age, around 315,000 years, comes mostly from thermoluminescence dating, of heated flints, supported by electron spin resonance ESR on teeth, and some uranium series work. The techniques are solid, but they come with assumptions that the flints were heated during the time of human occupation, that the sediment around the bones hasn't been massively disturbed, that the radiation environment has been reasonably constant. Skeptics ask, how sure are we that all the hood material belongs to the same time slice? The site is an old Castic cave system gutted by mining. That's not the pristine, undisturbed setting archaeologists dream of. Sediments have been removed, reworked, exposed. It raises the possibility that bones and tools from slightly different time periods might have been shuffled together. If, for example, some of the human fossils were a bit younger than the dated flints, you'd still have a very old Homo population in North Africa, but maybe not quite as close to the 300,000-year mark as the headlines say. So, context integrity becomes crucial. How tight is the association between the dated pieces and the actual skulls? How confident are we that the stratigraphy hasn't been scrambled? The Irhoud team has done a lot of careful work on this, reconstructing layers, reanalyzing old collections, matching patterns and breakage patterns. Their argument is that yes, mining damaged the cave, but enough original structure remains that the dates and fossils can be reliably linked. Some other researchers look at the same data and remain uneasy. Not outright rejection, just a persistent technical side-eye, show me more. Which leads to another constraint, sample size. Irhoud is famous, but it's still only a few individuals representing a narrow slice of a much larger population, preserved imperfectly, then reconstructed. Those reconstructions themselves are a target of criticism. When you digitally piece together a fragmentary skull, you have to make choices. How do you mirror left and right sides? What reference you use to fill missing bits? What warping from burial pressure you decide to correct and how much? Change those assumptions, and the shape subtly shifts. A forehead becomes a little steeper or flatter, a vault a bit rounder or longer. Usually these changes don't turn a Neanderthal into a modern human, or vice versa. But at the fine-grained level where people are arguing early sapiens versus archaic with sapient psyche traits, they matter. Skeptics of the strong Irhoud sapiens claim will say, we're putting a lot of weight on a small, partly reconstructed sample from a single site. How representative is this of North Africa at the time of Africa as a whole? That question connects to a deeper disagreement about the big picture. One narrative, the one Howard helped popularize, is the Pan-African worked model. In this view, there isn't a single birth village of Homo sapiens. There are multiple semic-connected populations across Africa, each carrying some subset of the traits we call modern faces get flat here. Brain cases around their pelvises shift somewhere else. Cultural innovations spread along the web. Over time, gene flow knits these regional pieces together into what we'd recognize as our species. An alternative narrative leans more on regional continuity. It says, yes, Africa was structured, but some regions played a more central, persistent role than others. Maybe East Africa or Southern Africa, or even some not yet identified refugium, hosted a core population that maintained a distinctive sapiens identity over hundreds of thousands of years. Other groups might be side branches, close relatives sharing genes and tools, but not direct mainline ancestors. In a stronger form, regional continuity models even flirt with the idea that different parts of Africa were evolving somewhat in parallel towards similar solutions, with repeated mixing smoothing the differences. In that framing, Irhoud might be one of several proto-sapiens experiments, some of which left more descendants than others. So what would move these debates to strengthen the Irhoud as early Homo sapiens in a Pan-African network view? You'd want more fossils from roughly the same time in other parts of Africa, showing similar mosaics of traits, modern faces, archaic brain cases, suggesting a widespread grade, not a one-off oddity. Better stratigraphic control and additional dating at Irhoud and comparable sites, confirming tight associations between fossils, tools, and layers. Ancient DNA from Irhouded material anywhere in Africa, tying these anatomies to lineages that clearly feed into later Homo sapiens populations. To strengthen the more cautious regional continuity-leaning view, you'd look for clear anatomical trends in some regions that march steadily from archaic to modern across time, without needing our hod-like forms to bridge the gap. Evidence that some early North African populations sit genetically or morphologically off to the side of later sapiens variation, implying a related, but ultimately extinct branch. Contradictory dates or contexts at Irhoud or similar sites that pull those fossils out of the crucial 300,000-year window. Right now, we don't have enough data to slam the door on any of these possibilities. The Irhoud fossils are real. The dates are plausible. The anatomy is undeniably intriguing, but how exactly they plug into the tangled web of African populations is still up for grabs. And that uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Science at the frontier looks like this: sharp disagreements over classification, intense arguments about layers and dates, simulations of ancient population structure that give slightly different answers each time you tweak a parameter. RRA's real impact isn't that it definitively rewrites human origins, it's that it forces everyone to put their models on the table and ask, can your version of our past make room for these faces in Morocco 300,000 years ago, living a life that was almost but not quite like ours? To see just how almost like ours that life might have been, we have to zoom in again, not on species names or gene trees, but on what a day at Jebel Irhoud may actually have felt like. We start with what we actually have: bones of animals, chipped stone, burned rock, traces of hearths. From that, we don't get a movie of daily life, we get bullet points. Then we have to carefully explicitly fill in the gaps. At Jebel Irhoud, the foral remains tell us something simple but important. These people were not just nibbling berries and digging tubers. They were interacting with big game. We see gazelles, zebras, wildebeest like bovids, sometimes even larger animals. The cut marks and breakage patterns on those bones are our first real window into behavior. When you find systematic cut marks near joint surfaces, especially on upper limbs and along the spine, that's usually butchery, not just scavenging the leftovers of another predator. When long bones are smashed open in consistent ways, that's marrow extraction, not random trampling. So, a cautious reading goes like this. The Irhoud people were at least capable of primary access to carcasses. They were getting there early, not just picking at scraps. Does that mean they were expert hunters with elaborate ambush tactics? Maybe, but expert is an interpretation. The evidence itself just says they had sharp tools, and they used them to take apart large animals and get high-value resources like meat and marrow. The tools help flesh out the picture. Irhoud is firmly Middle Stone Age with a strong level component. That means they weren't just banging rocks together until something sharp fell off. They were preparing cores in advance to knock off flakes of a particular size and shape. That planning shows up in the stones themselves. Archaeologists can see the sequence of blows shaping the core, setting up a striking platform, then the final well-aimed hit that releases the desired flake. It's like finding the negatives from an ancient manufacturing process. From this, we infer that hunting wasn't just grab whatever's at hand and run at the antelope. If you're investing time in standardized points and flakes, you probably have specific tasks in mind. Cutting hides, disarticulating joints, maybe tipping spears. The consistency suggests shared know-how, not just individual improvisation. There's another quiet clue in the stones where the raw material comes from. At Irhoud and comparable North African Middle Stone Age sites, many of the flints and CHS don't match the immediate bedrock. Some pieces can be traced to sources tens of kilometers away. That doesn't sound impressive until you remember there are no roads, no GPS, no maps. To carry the right stone to the right place repeatedly over thousands of years, you need a mental map of the landscape. You need to know that ridge over there has good nappable flint. That valley holds water in the dry season. That path is where herds move when the grasses shift. So we can say with some confidence, these people were mobile, probably seasonally mobile, tracking resources as the climate oscillated and local conditions changed. Did they follow migrating herds in regular circuits? Did they return to Irhoud as a kind of favored campsite? or hunting base year after year. The evidence isn't detailed enough to map their routes, but the combination of distant raw materials and repeated occupation layers points to groups that knew their wider region intimately and moved through it deliberately. All of that requires social organization. You don't just pop out of the womb knowing Levallois reduction sequences or the secret spring where the good stone is. That knowledge has to be transmitted. Here we leave solid ground and step onto more speculative terrain, but some inferences are hard to escape. Level technology isn't intuitive. Experimental studies with modern people show it takes practice and, crucially, instruction. If you fumble around long enough, you might reinvent something similar, but cultural transmission speeds the whole process up dramatically. So a plausible picture is small groups where elders, or at least more experienced nappers, showed novices what to do, not necessarily with lectures and technical jargon, but through demonstration, imitation, correction, hands guiding other hands, gestures indicating angles and force. What did those groups look like? Most models based on hunter-gatherer ethnography and on demographic constraints suggest something like 20 to 50 individuals in a local band embedded in a wider web of related bands. That's not direct evidence from Irhoud. It's a reasonable extrapolation from what it takes to maintain a viable gene pool and specialized skills across generations. Children would have grown up surrounded by these practices, watching animals being butchered, feeling the heat of controlled fires, listening to the rhythms of tool production. Their school was everyday life. Fire is an especially important part of that world because it quietly rewrites the schedule of a day. The burned flints at Irhoud, the reddened sediments, the charcoal traces, those are as close as we get to proof that people were regularly managing fire there. Not just wildfires sweeping through the landscape, but hearths where stones were heated enough to reset their thermoluminescent clocks. What does a hearth buy you? First time with firelight activities don't stop at sunset. Tool repair, hide working, storytelling, teaching, all can be pushed into the evening. That alone changes how much information a group can transmit and how flexible their daily routines can be. Second, safety. Predators are less likely to investigate a ring of flames and smoke. A campsite with fire is a different kind of space than one in the dark. People can sleep closer together, keep watch more effectively, and perhaps dare to occupy more exposed locations. Third, food processing. Even if we don't have direct residue evidence of roasting at Irhoud, the combination of butchered bones and fire makes cooking extremely likely. Cooking softens tough meat, makes marrow easier to access, detoxifies some plants, and increases the energy yield from starchy foods. Over evolutionary time, that can support smaller guts and bigger brains over the scale of an individual life. It means more reliable calories from the same landscape. Again, we have to draw clear lines. The evidence shows controlled fire and big game butchery. The inference is that people were using heat to cook some of what they ate and reorganizing their days around the hearth. Put all these strands together and a cautious reconstruction emerges. Irhoud people or populations like them probably lived in small kin-structured bands that moved across a familiar territory, revisiting good water sources, raw material outcrops, and productive hunting grounds. They used planned stone technologies to process animal carcasses and other resources, and they relied on controlled fire to extend daylight, protect camps, and transform food. Knowledge about stone, animals, seasons, and fire had to move from one generation to the next. Whether that transmission came with anything we'd recognize as language, myth, or teaching roles is where evidence thins out and imagination tempts us forward. We can't hear their conversations or see their rituals, but we can say this. By 300,000 years ago in North Africa, life was not just a raw contest of teeth and claws. It was already a social, technological, and ecological balancing act built on cooperation, planning, and shared memory. The question is, when do those shared memories start to look like ours, with symbols, art, and maybe even explicit stories about who we are? That's where we turn next. When people hear 300,000-year-old Homo sapiens, there's a reflex assumption. Oh, so they were just like us. Same skull shape? Not quite. Same tools? Not really. Same minds. That's the hardest question of all. Anthropologists make a distinction that sounds nitpicky, but matters a lot. Anatomical modernity versus behavioral modernity. Anatomical modernity is about bones, rounded skulls, small faces tucked under the brain case, lighter skeletons, a particular arrangement of jaws and teeth. Jebel Irhoud fits a lot of that profile in the face, but with a long, low brain case that still looks a bit archaic. These are early Homo sapiens, not quite the textbook version. Behavioral modernity is about what those brains actually do. Do they use symbols? Do they make art? Do they create abstract categories like clan or ancestor or spirit? Do they plan far into the future, invent rituals, tell stories? Those two timelines overlap, but they're not neatly locked together. If you jump forward from Rewrote by 200,000 years or so, you suddenly hit a very different kind of record in Africa. In southern Africa, at sites like Blumbo's Cave, you get pieces of ochre engraved with cross-hatched patterns that don't seem to have any practical function. They're not cutting tools. They're not drills. Someone took time to scratch repeated deliberate designs into a red mineral that stains like blood. Are those marks art notation? An early logo for a group identity? Nobody can say for sure, but they are intentional patterns with no obvious survival payoff. That's a big hint that symbolic thinking was on the table. At roughly the same time, and a little later, other clues start to appear. You see perforated shells small enough to be strung as beads, sometimes with wear patterns, right at the hole, as if they were rubbed against a cord or each other. You see carefully selected pieces of ochre brought into caves from outside and ground to powders, probably for body painting or decorating objects. You see bone tools shaped into points and spatulas, not just as accidental byproducts of butchery, but as a separate technological tradition. Taken together, this cluster of behaviors, personal ornamentation, abstract engraving, structured toolkits with specialized parts, is what people often mean by modern behavior. It's not one invention like a light switch. It's a package of habits and ideas that signal a new way of being human. But here's the catch. These things show up at different times in different places. North Africa has its own Middle Stone Age story. Sites like Rewrote in Morocco and others across the Maghreb hint at complex behaviors later than Irhoud use of marine resources, possible personal ornaments, careful processing of plant foods. East Africa has early pigments and maybe symbolic use of color. South Africa has engraved ochres and shell beads. None of this rolls out in a single coordinated revolution. So, one plausible picture is that what we call behavioral modernity wasn't a sudden mutation that flipped on in one valley somewhere. It was a series of cultural thresholds. Maybe groups along one coast stumbled into the social power of body paint, using red ochre to mark group membership, maturity, or special roles. Maybe highland groups somewhere else began marking seasons or hunts with notches on bone. Maybe riverine communities developed naming systems for kin that allowed more complex marriage rules and alliances. Each of these is small on its own. But once invented, these tricks don't stay put. Remember those Stone Age networks we talked about? Bands connected to bands, exchanging mates, raw materials, and gossip. In that web, a good idea, a more efficient hunting ritual, a striking ornament that carries status, a mnemonic pattern that helps remember who owes what to whom, can spread much faster than genes. Cultural evolution piggybacks on those connections, and it can leapfrog geography in ways that biology can't. A shell ornament tradition or a style of engraving could jump from group to group, reshaping how people think of themselves long before everyone shares the exact same skeletal shape we call modern, which brings us back to Irhoud. We don't see beads or engravings there. We don't have carved figurines or cave paintings. On a strict conservative reading, the site shows advanced stone technology, big game butchery, controlled fire, and repeated occupation. All impressive, all clearly beyond what earlier hominins were doing, but not yet the full symbolic fireworks of later sites. Does that mean the Hood people lacked symbolism? Not necessarily. The archaeological record is biased badly. It loves stone, bone, and fired things. It hates wood, fiber, leather, plant dyes, and sound. If Hood people braided plant fibers into intricate belts, those are gone. If they decorated their hair with flowers or feathers, we'll never see it. If they painted each other with ochre that washed away in a few days, the pigment might never be preserved. If they sang complex songs, or named constellations, or told origin stories around the fire, that entire universe of meaning vanished with their voices. Even early art can be almost invisible. Sand drawings smoothed away by the next gust of wind, patterns traced in ash and then trampled, arrangements of bones or stones that look random to us because we don't share the code. A child's repeated game of lining up pebbles by size might have been the seed of a counting system, but archaeologically it's just pebbles. So when we ask, did Irhoud people think like us? We're stuck balancing two truths. One, the earliest unambiguous symbols and ornaments we found so far are younger and mostly come from other regions of Africa. That suggests that explicitly symbolic culture, as we'd recognize it, really ramps up later. Two, the cognitive and social foundations needed for that ramp up. Teaching, planning, long deed distance memory, flexible cooperation are already strongly implied at Irhoud. It's entirely possible that the minds at Irhoud were capable of symbolism, but their particular symbolic traditions either hadn't crystallized into durable material forms or simply failed to fossilize. What would count as proof? An engraved object with a repeated, non-functional pattern from 300,000-year-old layers. A deliberate arrangement of bones or stones with clear structure that can't be explained by butchery or practical use. Pigment used in contexts strongly tied to bodies, not just hide processing. Anything that says someone here was marking a difference that only exists in the mind until we find that we're in a gray zone. We can say that by 300,000 years ago, people in Morocco looked a lot like us from the nose down, used planned technologies, organized their lives around fire, and lived in social worlds rich enough to sustain shared knowledge over generations. We can suspect that somewhere in those firelit circles, words and ideas were already doing things we'd recognize. Naming kin, marking territories, shaping identities. Whether they already told stories about gods or painted their own myths on skin instead of cave walls is an open wound in the record. And it's exactly the kind of wound that a single well-placed discovery could start to heal. So how do we get from that gray zone of maybe symbolic, maybe not, to a headline that screams discovery in Morocco rewrites human history? Let's slow that down. Science doesn't usually rewrite itself in one dramatic plot twist. It creeps, argues, double-checks, and then only when the evidence refuses to go away, it quietly moves the furniture. Jebel Irhoud is a perfect case study in how that actually works. For decades, those Moroccan fossils were misdated. They were thought to be maybe 40,000 years old, roughly in line with the classic modern human story. We evolve in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, then slowly spread, then leave Africa around 60,000 years ago. Neat arrows on a map, a single cradle, a clean timeline you can put in a textbook diagram. Then more careful work started piling up. The AOE material was re-excavated. Better stratigraphic control, more context, new dating methods were applied to burnt flints and teeth. Thermoluminescence, electron spin resonance, multiple teams, multiple checks. The dates came back around 300,000 years. That wasn't just a rounding error. That pushed recognizably Homo sapiens like faces a full 100,000 years earlier than the standard model. And in a place that hadn't been cast as the cradle, now a single date from a single lab wouldn't have done much. People would have shrugged and waited for more data. What made her hood powerful was the way it locked into a pattern that was already starting to form. East Africa had Homo and Rewrote, with early Homo sapiens around 195,000, 160,000 years ago. South Africa had intriguing fossils and long, complex Middle Stone Age sequences. Genetic studies were whispering that our lineage might be older and more structured than the simple single small population, one time, one place story. Irhoud wasn't a lone rebel. It was a loud, well-dated data point that forced everyone to look again at the map and realize our origin story was too narrow. This is how scientific consensus shifts, not because one charismatic scientist announces a new theory at a press conference and everyone salutes, but because new data start to contradict the old shortcuts. Labs repeat the work or apply different techniques. Other fossils get re-examined with fresh eyes. Models are tweaked, then broken, then rebuilt to accommodate the stubborn facts. The rhetoric, though, the way this gets translated into headlines, is much less patient. Rewrites. Human history is short, dramatic, and clickable. It tells you there was a single canonical story, neatly written, and now one heroic discovery has crossed it out in red ink. In reality, who didn't burn the old history book? It took a thick marker, circled a section, and wrote "too simple" in the margin. The single cradle in East Africa 200,000 years ago model wasn't pure fantasy. It was a reasonable summary of the best data available 20 or 30 years ago. What Irhoud and other finds are doing is adding chapters, moving the first appearance date and changing the shape of the family tree from a trunk to a braided river. But here's where one site really can change the world, not because the story is suddenly finished, but because it changes where people look and what questions they feel allowed to ask. Before Irhoud was redated, a lot of research energy and grant money flowed to a few obvious hotspots: the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, some key caves and river systems in South Africa, a handful of famous Levantine sites. North Africa, especially the high plateaus and the edges of what is now the Sahara, looked more peripheral. Interesting, sure, but not central to the origin story. After Irhoud, that mental map shifted. If Homo sapiens like people were in Morocco 300,000 years ago, then you can't treat Northwest Africa as a backwater. You have to ask, what else is buried under those rocky plains? What was happening across the Sahara during its green phases when it was full of lakes and rivers? How were populations moving between what we now call North and Sub-Saharan Africa when that boundary didn't exist? Funding agencies notice these questions. Survey teams get assembled. Remote sensing projects start scanning for buried river channels and ancient shorelines. Governments and museums in North African countries gain new leverage to argue. Our landscapes are central to the human story, not just side notes. That's the practical impact of rewriting textbooks. It's not just changing a date in a caption. It's re-entering whole regions in the research agenda, which in turn leads to more fieldwork, more students trained, more cores drilled, more caves sifted grain by grain. And that radiates out even further. If you treat early Homo sapiens as a Pan-African phenomenon, a network of populations spread across multiple ecological zones, then suddenly the empty spaces on the map look suspicious. A central Sahara, the Sahel belt running from Sahel to Sudan, areas that today are politically unstable, logistically brutal, or just staggeringly large. Many of those zones would have been prime real estate during humid phases, lakes glittering where there is now only dust, rivers carving through what is now dune field. The odds that Jebel Irhoud just happens to be the only site from this time period worth caring about are effectively zero. What's much more likely is that Irhoud is one of the rare places where geology, erosion, mining, and archaeological luck have combined to expose what is elsewhere still buried. There are probably campsites, kill sites, caves, and lakeshore settlements from 300,000, 400,000, maybe even 500,000 years ago, lying under meters of sediment in the Sahara and Sahel. Some of them might hold the engraved object, the pigment cache, the bone arrangement that finally lets us say with evidence, yes, here is symbolic behavior at Hoddage time depth. Right now, those are invisible. Jebel Irhoud is what happens when one of them pokes its head above ground. New surveys are launched, new collaborations are formed, New students grow up taking a Pan-African origin as the default, not the radical alternative. 10 or 20 years later, the next generation of textbooks quietly present a totally different map. And for them, that's just normal. From the inside, it doesn't feel like a sudden rewrite. It feels like living through a long, messy edit, where every paragraph of our origin story gets nudged, annotated, and sometimes ripped out and replaced. Jebel Irhoud just happened to be one of those sentences where after the data came in, nobody could defend the old wording with a straight face anymore. And it won't be the last time that happens. Because if our hood taught us anything, it's that the biggest discoveries aren't always about what we find. They're about where those finds point next toward all the missing sites, all the uncharted basins and drowned coastlines, all the pieces of our story that are still lying in the dark, waiting for someone to ask a better question. So if hood was a sentence we had to rewrite, what are the next sentences that could force another edit? In human origins research, there are a few kinds of discoveries that really move the needle. Not every new bone or stone tool does it. You need combinations. One is simple, blunt, and incredibly rare. More skulls with good dates from the right time windows. Right now, that 300,000, 500,000 year window in Africa is like a book with half the pages torn out. We have Irhoud in Morocco, a handful of important but fragmentary fossils in East and South Africa, and then long stretches of silence. Imagine finding a nearly complete skull in, say, central Chad, dated securely to 350,000 years ago, with a face just as modern-looking as maybe an even more globular brain case. That would be big. It would tell us hood isn't a weird outlier. It's one node in a widespread population. Or imagine the opposite, a skull from the same age in some forgotten basin of Ethiopia that looks more archaic, more like Homo heidelbergensis, but with one or two surprising modern features. Perhaps a chin developing early, or a retracted face on an otherwise robust body. Each of those finds would force us to redraw the evolutionary lines differently. Are we looking at a smooth gradient of change across Africa? Parallel experiments in different regions, or multiple lineages that sometimes merge and sometimes die out? Bones alone, though, don't settle the story. Context is everything. One of the holy grails would be early hearths. Undeniable, repeatedly used fireplaces, securely dated to the Irhoud time range or older, with clear association to specific kinds of tools and maybe even food remains. Right now we know that hominins were using fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, but tightly dated, well-preserved hearths with surrounding debris, bone fragments with cut marks, broken stone cores, maybe traces of plant food. Let us see daily life, not just anatomy. Find a lakeshore camp in the ancient Sahara with a cluster of hearths at 350,000 years ago. A toolkit that looks recognizably Middle Stone Age and hominin remains that fall in the Homo sapiens-ish zone. That's the sort of site that would make archaeologists sit up straight. Because then we're not just saying modern faces existed early. We're saying modernish bodies, modernish tools, and complex use of fire and landscape were all coming together in multiple places earlier than we thought. What makes these hypothetical sites powerful isn't just what they'd contain. It's what we can do with them now that we couldn't do even a couple of decades ago. Dating methods are getting better and more cross-checkable. Thermoluminescence and ESR, like at Rewrote, were already a leap forward. Today we're layering on more tools. Improved uranium series dating for cave deposits, optically stimulated luminescence for sediments, sometimes even argon-argon dating on volcanic layers bracketing a site. Each method has its quirks and error bars, but when multiple independent clocks converge on the same age, confidence goes way up. That's how isolated finds become anchors in the timeline instead of question marks. Then there's what we can do with the bones themselves. Three-dimensional morphometrics, high-resolution scans, statistical shape analysis has taken paleoanthropology from "this looks kind of modern to me" to here is exactly how this skull differs from both Neanderthals and classic Homo sapiens across hundreds of measured points. If we start finding more Irhoud material across Africa, these tools will let researchers see patterns that the naked eye can't. subtle differences in jaw shape between West and East, gradual changes in brain case roundness over time, regional signatures that line up or clash with what genetics predicts. And it's not just bones. Sediment itself has become a kind of fossil, sedimentary DNA, tiny fragments of genetic material preserved in cave dirt or ancient lake beds, is already rewriting parts of the Neanderthal and Denisovan story. In some places we've detected hominin DNA in sediments where no bones were preserved at all. Applying those methods across African caves and ancient river systems could in theory reveal which hominin lineages were present even when the skeletons are gone. Maybe one day someone will pull a core from a buried Saharan lakebed, filter the mud, and find genetic traces that link an unknown population to hood-like people or to something stranger. Isotopes add yet another layer. By analyzing the ratios of certain elements in teeth and bones, we can infer diet and mobility. Did these early Homo sapiens-like folks eat mostly grassland animals or a mix with fish and plants? Were they staying near one water source or moving seasonally across large territories? Tie that to better dates and suddenly you're watching different African populations experiment with different survival strategies at the same time. That's the kind of evidence that can test the Pan-African model in detail rather than just as a slogan. But to do any of this, we have to actually get to the right places. Africa is enormous, and most of it has barely been touched by systematic paleoanthropological work. The Great Rift Valley has been dug and redug. A few South African cave systems have names that show up in textbooks. Morocco now has massive regions in between, and north and west, and deep into the interior are still almost archaeological blank spots. Central Sahara basins, the Sahel corridor stretching across the continent, parts of the Congo basin, high plateaus in places like Algeria, Niger, Sudan. Many of these areas are politically difficult, logistically nightmarish, or simply overwhelming in scale. Yet, climate models and ancient lake maps say during green Sahara phases, these were prime real estate. Grasslands, rivers, wetlands, a patchwork of habitats where different human groups could thrive, meet, mix, and split. If the Pan-African origin idea is robust, those under-sampled regions are where it has to face its hardest tests. Do we find Ehud-like people everywhere? Or do we start to see clear regional differentiation? North African populations trending one way, Eastern ones another, Southern ones doing something else entirely. Do earlier sapiens-like traits show up even farther back in time in places we haven't looked yet? A partial skull from 400,000 years ago in West Africa with a surprisingly modern face would push the origin of our characteristic anatomy back again and stretch that braided river even wider. It's also possible that some of the biggest game changers won't be dazzling new fossils at all, but quiet reanalysis of material that's been sitting in museum drawers for decades. Old collections from colonial-era digs once dismissed as archaic Homo with vague dates might get redated and rescanned and suddenly slot into this new picture. That's essentially what happened with the hood. The bones didn't change, the context and the questions did. If you zoom out, that's the real lesson here. The story of where we came from isn't a finished epic with a neat final chapter. It's more like a draft that keeps getting scribbled over as we find new lines of evidence and invent new tools to read them. The next hood might be under a sand dune in Mauritania, in a flooded cave off the Red Sea coast, or mislabeled in a basement collection somewhere in Khartoum or Nairobi. It might come from a brand new survey, guided by satellite imagery, or from a fragment of DNA pulled out of what looks like unremarkable mud. Wherever it appears, odds are it won't hand us a simple answer. It will hand us better questions and force us to move the furniture again. For now, Jebel Irhoud is one of our clearest windows into an early chapter of Homo sapiens. But it's only one window in one wall of a very large, very unfinished house. And every season, somewhere in Africa, someone is out there with a GPS, and a notebook, trying to find the next crack in the story. So after all of this, What does Jebel Irhoud actually change when we say, where did humans come from? First, the solid stuff. Oh, really is old. Multiple dating methods converge on roughly 300,000 years ago, give or take the usual error bars. That puts these people far earlier than the classic modern human fossils that used to anchor our story at around 200,000 years. Second, those faces. If you passed an Irhoud person on a crowded street in modern clothes, you might not look twice. The flat tucked-in face, the jawline, the teeth, those are well within the range of Homo sapiens. That's why this site hit like a thunderclap. It said parts of what we call modern anatomy were in place much earlier than we thought. But then you go around to the back of the skull and the story gets weird again. The brain case is long, low, not yet the rounded basketball-like dome you see in recent humans. This is that mosaic evolution in the flesh. Faces modernizing first, brains and skull shapes catching up later, maybe in different regions at different times. Put those together, and Hood strongly supports one big idea. Our origins weren't a single magic moment in one little valley. They look more like a long braided process spread across Africa, different populations in different habitats carrying different pieces of the modern human package and trading them over hundreds of thousands of years. That broad Pan-African picture has a lot of support now from other fossils, from genetics, from climate models that show shifting green corridors tying the continent together. But there's also a lot we still don't know. Even now, we still don't know exactly which ancient human groups eventually became our direct ancestors and which belonged to evolutionary branches that disappeared without leaving descendants. We still can't say with certainty how language, behavior, and symbolic thinking developed alongside those physical changes. And we certainly don't possess a perfectly complete map showing every step of that journey. What we do have is a new perspective on our origins. Instead of one precise birthplace marked on a map, we see a shared African story, with people adapting as deserts became grasslands, and grasslands returned to desert, meeting, separating, blending, and reconnecting across generations. It is a story of ancestors spread across an entire continent, already remarkably adaptable, already mastering tools, controlling fire, and building increasingly complex social lives. Thank you for listening to this presentation of Soft History Stories. We hope you enjoyed this journey. These stories have survived for thousands of years, reminding us of the power of love, the danger of pride, and the timeless truths that connect us all. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shaped our world. Good night and sleep well.